Welcome to our series on the imagination, where we explore the depths, the deep psychology of formation and projection. We entitled this particular part 3, Timeless Imagination. We are going to have a look at why I gave it this title, and we'll kick off our presentation with two world-renowned authors. The first author is the author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, which really needs no introduction. And she makes the following statement about imagination. She says, imagination is not only the unique human capacity to envision that which is not, and therefore the fountain of all invention and innovation. It is arguably the most transformative and revelatory capacity. It is the power that enables us to empathize with humans whose experiences we have never shared. The next one is J.R.R. Tolkien of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. This most extraordinary man was able to speak 19 languages, and he invented 14 more for the characters in his secondary creation, in his Middle-earth world. Very remarkable. In his essays to Charles Williams, that was presented to Charles Williams, he writes an essay on fairy stories, and it is from this essay that we draw the following remarks. He says, the human mind is capable of forming mental images of things not actually present. The faculty of conceiving these images is or was naturally called imagination, but in recent times, technical, not normal language, imagination has often held to be something higher than the mere image making ascribed to operations of the fancy, which is a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made, says he, to restrict, misapply indeed, the imagination to the power of giving to ideal creations, mental creations, the inner consistency of reality. He continues, he says, ridiculous though it may be for one so ill-instructed to have an opinion in this critical matter, I venture to think that the verbal distinction is philologically inappropriate and the analysis is inaccurate. Philology is the study of language, and these people are really experts in their fields. He says that imagination is the mental power of image making, that is, formation and forming, is one thing or aspect, and it should appropriately be called imagination. The perception of the image, the grasp of its implications, and the control which are necessary to successful expression of the image may vary in vividness and strength. But this is a difference of degree in imagination and not a difference in kind. The achievement of the expression which gives or seems to give the inner consistency of reality is indeed another thing or aspect needing another name. And here is the surprising name he gives it. Art. Art. The operative link between imagination and the final result, subcreation. Subcreation, says he, is a world which our minds can enter, and that inside that world, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that secondary world. For my present purpose, says he, I require a word which shall embrace both the subcreative art in itself and a quality of strangeness and wonder in expression derived from the image, a quality essentially to fairy stories. That word is fantasy. I propose, therefore, to arrogate myself the powers of Humpty Dumpty and to use fantasy for this purpose. In a sense, that is, which combines with its older and higher use as an equivalent of imagination the derived notions of unreality, that is, of unlikeness of the subcreation to the primary world, and of a freedom from the domination of observed fact, in short, of the fantastic. The link below in the show more button, he concludes, fantasy in this sense is, I think, not lower, a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, it's the most potent. It is exactly with this idea of internal self-discovery and higher order imagination and knowledge, a contemplative art, that thinkers in antiquity and great antiquity developed their mythology, their cultures, as well as their astronomical, numerical, and philosophical and geometric sciences. Indeed, contrary to modern belief, there is nothing primitive about this internal psychological art. We, as a Western civilization, we think, appear to have lost our deep roots with this divine order and the formative movement of Psyche, the soul. The ancient mythological images that transfers this idea of formation and its appearances from this ancient art to our time is the image of the projective forming fantasy, which forming is similar, say they, to images in a mirror or like reflections on water, on the surfaces of water, or reflections of polished surfaces. That they call, this reflection is called katoptros is the Greek word for that. Hence, say they, instantaneous forming mirror images mirror reflections, appearances, which are intellectual formations, may be viewed as imitations, or rather reflection asymmetries of higher order internal symmetry and its discovery. Internal objects of intellect, the nature of which is unknown, and to be discovered through this inward-looking art of contemplation. As we've seen from Tolkien and Rowling, our imagination and its control is necessary for the formation and unfoldment of higher knowledge in our souls. That our imagination plays a frontal or a foundational role in the formation of higher order mental constructs, and in addition, that they surpass the facts of logic and theory should have become obvious up to now. If then the fantasy or our imagination possesses relevance in every age, for both modern and ancient people attests to the fantasy and its formation, its assimilating operation, does it not indicate some psychological stability of image formation within us that would be appropriately described as timeless forming imagination? But we ask, how can such a deep stability be possible within us unless it is held through and is intertwined with a greater imaginative web of formation? Says that inimitable Richard Feynman, the imagination of nature is far greater than human imagination. Would we not now say that this imagination represents a deeper hidden order and psychology of projective world image formation hitherto undiscovered? Let us view the remarks of Tolkien and Rowling above as the first view. In other words, we are views 2 through 5 to come in this presentation. I had to put myself back in the picture here. The second view we will find in the work of Freud, Jung and Melanie Klein. Freud introduced the concept of unconscious fantasies and fantasizing, which he thought of as a phylogenetically inherited evolutionary capacity of the human mind. He gets his ideas from Darwin. Freud views the fantasy as unconscious, wish-fulfilling imagination dominated by primary unconscious process function and kept apart from reality testing. His important work in analytical psychology and on repression, projective identification, and unconscious psychical complexes applies. It's a mouthful, and I'm not a fan. There's a link to some of the works in the Show More button for those who are interested to learn more. Next, we provide an overview of the imagination in the Gnostic analytic psychology of Jung and Melanie Klein. On active imagination, Jung says, imagination, imaginatio is the Latin word, is the active evocation, the inner formation, the bringing forth of inner images from the individual collective unconscious, secundum naturam, that is in its natural religious setting, an authentic feat of thought or ideation which does not spin aimless and groundless fantasies into the blue. In other words, it does not play with the objects of its perception, says he. Active imagination tries to grasp the inner facts, archetypes, and portray them in images true to their religious nature. Activity, from the ancient Egyptian deity Abraxas and Heraclitus, who have a material monistic worldview, says he, is an opus, a work. This activity appears to be interconnected with an active unconscious principle. This imagination, says he, needs to be purified to achieve this opus, and its goal of biophysiological integration of opposites, the essence of man's biophysiological self-realization. The imagination is to be understood here as the real and literal power to create images, Einbildungskraft, imagination, is the German word, in the interaction with the projections of the unconscious. Melanie Klein and her successors have emphasized that unconscious fantasies interact reciprocally with experience to form the developing intellectual and emotional characteristics of the individual. Fantasies are considered to be a basic capacity underlying and shaping or organizing thought, dream symptoms and patterns of defense. Reference below. On projective identification, very important, she says, projective identification is an unconscious fantasy in which aspects of the self and internal object are split off and attributed to an external object outside of the perceiver. The projected aspects may be felt by the projector, the perceiver, to be either good or bad. Projective fantasies of identification may or may not be accompanied by evocative behavior, meaning behavior brought forth, unconsciously intoned to induce the recipient of the projection to feel and act in accordance with the projective fantasy. To evoke, to bring forth, to outform, to project. Klein says, fantasies of projective identification are sometimes felt to have acquisitive and attributive properties, meaning that the fantasy involves not only getting rid of aspects of one's own psyche, the bad, but also of entering the mind of someone else, of the other external, in order to acquire the desired, the good aspects of his psyche. In this case, says she, external projective and introjective fantasies operate together. The resolution of opposites is the goal of ego integration and therapy. Hence, projection is a defense mechanism of the ego that protects the ego. That could be the individual, an organization, a government, or a culture, or a civilization from disintegration and threat to its psychological orientation, and to protect the ego against fear of loss, of lack, and ultimately against its own emptiness and lack of power. We have the following notes to make about this. We can see the psychological operation of formation and projection as a defense and attack strategy at work, for instance, in elections in the USA. In their campaign advertisements, lawyers or political candidates point out the sleaze, the horrible, the terrible, the abject and the bad in their opponents. Those people, they ought to be jailed for doing these kind of things. It is atrocious what they did. While in the same advertisement, they portray the good they hold out of themselves to their voters. In the news media, we see a similar phenomenon. This type of projective phenomena is most obvious in the political flip-flop in opinions when elections brings about a shift from one election to the other. The consequence which we have to bear is an inevitable governance through extremes who lost, as it appears, the compass of sound discrimination. There is very little to no stability in governance and financial markets. The solution to this, unification and sound governance, lies somewhere between these extremes. This type of deliberate psychological formation forms a classical psychological offset and can be seen in attempts to portray that what you have to offer is better when you compare it to this product or that person or with other things. That is to say, this formation entails the deceptive attempt to sell to the viewer a contrast whose aim is to make clear the distinction between the bad, the evil in the other, and to hold out the good in himself of his research, his approach, or his product. This psychological offset amounts then, therefore, to the deliberate manipulation of mass hypnosis, mass enchantment, or passion. The worst part, it appears to work. Elections are won on these bases in Europe and the US. The solutions to this, decisions made upon conclusions based on actual statistics and science would help. But where would one now find such trustworthy things these days? For as it appeared to us, there is a justified mistrust and skepticism of the mighty institution, the great professor and the director of science, and the things that it produces by doing this kind of thing, by a good proportion of inquisitive people. Mistrust. I have many friends who tell me they don't trust anymore what comes out of social media or any one of these kinds of things. Which brings us to the third view. The 5 books of Moses. This third view may be observed in the divine imagination of the Torah or the 5 books of Moses. For God, says the classical Hebrew interpreters, divinely imagines through his word, logos forming sound, the image, soul, or spirit of man, his likeness. First, as it appeared to us in the formation of the masculine and feminine soul and spirit, before the creation of the heavens, the earth, the aquatic world, the airy world, the world of birds, and the terrestrial world of animals. Moreover, it appears to us it's only after the separation of Adam and Eve from Eden that God creates a body for man from dust, breathing his spirit into his nostrils, after which he creates a help, woman. Here is the thing though, it also appeared to us that it is after their separation and division from Eden that they both for the first time saw themselves. This separation from God appeared to possess as its basis man's own disobedience and his fall from Eden, and which leads to his galut or exile. The manifest world of man and nature forms upon the very basis of the likeness of the image to God, of spirit, soul, and word, indeed, logos or word forming. The ever-presence of God's immanent divine will holds the physical world in every moment. From hence the dependence of the endurance and of the evolution of the whole manifest world. Which brings us to the 4th view. Zen Buddhism, where we will briefly look at Huang-Po's sermon. Huang-Po is the a Zen Buddhist who lived in 850 AD. Huang-Po's sermon, which we get from his treatise on the essentials of the transmission of mind. The Buddha, 600 BC, says he, teaches, I have not had anything attained in my attainment of enlightenment. Buddhas and sentient beings grow out of one mind, and there is no other reality than this mind. The Buddha is an enlightened one who has seen into the reason of existence. Sentient beings are ignorant multitudes, confused in mind and full of defilements, attachments, passions, appetites, bodies, and stuff. The external world objects of sense hold no enlightenment or liberation, freedom from cherishing imagination, forming enchantment, passion, attraction, sensation, attachment, leads to Buddha. All learning is internal transmission from Buddha to mind. To form or create external mind, to perceive Buddha is cherishing imagination. True fantasy, an impossible, externally formed phantom and appearance, and therefore unattainable in all external searches and their forms. Essentially, there is no distinction between Buddha and sentient beings. From the perspective of one mind, these are not two. There are two entrances to the path to enlightenment, right conduct and right reason. Understanding that all things in their nature are without possessions, without attainments, without dependence, without passion, without abiding place. That is to say, always moving, flowing, without mutual conditioning, you will become free from cherishing imagination, phantasmata, or appearances, formation, projection, which is to realize bodhi. In other words, don't look for the truth, just stop cherishing opinions. Realizing bodhi is realizing Buddha knowledge. Thich Nhat Hanh, the beautiful Thich Nhat Hanh, he sums it up. That darling sums it up like this. He says, all life is suffering. All suffering is made better to overcome, better or overcome by practicing compassion. Compassion and love is not two. It is the only reality. In the next view we have is the view in the Vedanta on imagination or Maya. The highest art, says the Vedanta, of creation or Maya, the feminine principle, Adi Sakti, the principle of material formation. And here I have done the same thing. Let me just get my picture up here and go back to what we have here. There we go. The highest art of creation or Maya is the creative power of deity, Brahman. Maya, the means whereby he divinely imagines, Brahman, thought or the thought out thought, or Vikshipa Sakti, the power of projection, the universe, or thinks it into being. Just as Maya is the consort of Isvara, or the creative principle, and it's the power of Maya, which is Isvara. Isvara may be described as a logos, or ideal creative cause, Namarupe, Sanskrit, or name-forming, formative imagination or projection of the Vedanta and the Upanishads. All gods and men are under the sway of Maya, the psychical flowing movement of the material forming cause, the Divine Mother, Adi Sakti or Maya, and changing forms in time. Light and its illumination is the only true existence, the illuminated Atman, the self or the soul. Foundational to formation is wholeness, a microcosm within a macrocosm, within which man is the microcosm. Forms and their appearances are ever changing. All appearances are changeable or convertive on the basis of true knowledge, yoga, meaning unification, and Vidya, knowledge. The immaterial world holds within itself masculine and feminine energies, and these two, the differentiated world masculine and the infinite undifferentiated feminine, who contains all the forms, are necessary for formation of differentiation, the formed world, the manifest, the formless, the immanifest. Masculine and feminine vibrations are in opposition. From the Drsya Viveka, the discrimination between the seer and the seen of Sankara, he is Sri Sankara is a teacher of the Vedanta. He says, in the words of Swami Vivekananda, Sankara says in his, he says the following: that Atman, or the self, the soul, is the real, the illuminated fountain of all appearances. The direct and immediate knowledge, Vidya, of Atman or self is the means of the attainment of liberation, world unification. Link below. Some of the central ideas in Sankara's philosophy are divine imagination, Maya, Vikshepa Sakti, the power of projection, Avarana Sakti, meaning the veiled, the hidden, and the principled knowledge, Vidya, of self. Sankara says the external form or figure is perceived. This is a classical Upanishad. The external form, figure, is perceived, and the I is the perceiver. It, the I, is perceived, and the mind is its perceiver. In our first and second parts, we have seen already some ideas around this concept. The mind with its modifications, differentiation, attributes or qualities is perceived, and the internal witness, the self, is verily the perceiver, says he. But it, the witness, is not perceived by any other. Swami Vivekananda explains the meaning of this teaching, and this is a classical form of explanation. Form, in the preceding paragraph, the word implies all external objects of sense perception. The I stands for all the organs of perception, such as the nose, the ears, and so on. The perceiver, the I is the perceiver only in a relative sense, because it is itself perceived by the mind. The mind, the sense organs, unless the mind is attached to them, cannot perceive their objects. In a state of deep sleep, the sense organs do not perceive anything because the mind at that time ceases to function. It, the Atman, soul or inmost self, is the ultimate perceiver. If a perceiver of the Atman is sought, the inquiry will end in what is known as a regressus ad infinitum, an infinite regress. All entities, from the gross external objects to the mind, are the products of avidya, lack of knowledge, appearances, or ajnana, which itself is insentient. Hence, they also partake of the nature of insentiency, lack of knowledge. Therefore, they are objects. The subjective character of some of these is only relative, but the self is the ultimate seer because no other seer is known to exist. The knowledge of the knower is never absent. Maya, or imagination, is the art through which the divine Brahman brings the world into formation. Masculine and feminine energies are necessary for world formation. There we go. What could we now say with all these kinds of things that we have heard? There perhaps won't be a more apt mixture of the various ways in which to describe mental conceptions which underlie all these views that we've just had, mental conceptions and formation, than we can see in the remarks of Einstein in his article to the Franklin Institute in 1936 on his general consideration concerning the method of science. There he is. He says, our psychological experience contain in colorful succession sense experiences, memory pictures of them, images and feelings. In contrast to psychology, physics treats directly only of sense experiences and of the understanding of their connection. But even the concept of the real external world, says he, of everyday thinking rests exclusively on sense impressions. Just what we've been discussing all the time. Now we must remark that the differentiation between sense impressions and images, that is to say of the external objective world, is not possible, or at least not possible with absolute certainty, as we have seen in part 2 of our series. Of this series, with a discussion of this problem, says he, which affects also the notion of reality. We will not concern ourselves, but we shall take the existence of sense experiences as given, that is to say, as psychic experiences of a special kind. A little further on, he makes these observations. He says, out of the multitude of our sense experiences, we take mentally and arbitrarily certain repeatedly occurring complexes of sense impressions, partly in conjunction with sense impressions which are interpreted as signs, symbols for sense experiences of others, and we correlate them to a mental concept, the concept of the bodily object. Considered logically, this concept is not identical with the totality of sense impressions referred to, but it is a free creation of the human or animal mind. And here is the thing, comprehensibility implies the production of some sort of order among sense impressions, this order being produced by the creation of general concepts, mental concepts, relations between these concepts, and by definite relations of some kind between the concepts and sense experience. It is in this sense that the world of sense experience is comprehensible. But here is what he says about it. The fact that it is comprehensible in this sense is a miracle, because to understand something that's comprehensible in a world of delusion and hallucination, is how he puts it, is a miracle. He says, I believe that the first step in the setting of a real world, where is that picture of our friend? There he is. He says, I believe that the first step in the setting of a real external world is the formation of the mental concept of bodily objects and of bodily objects of various kinds. I think it's worth repeating, because it's exactly, if we look at it, isn't this what Tolkien says in The Lord of the Rings? I believe that the first step in the setting of real external world is the formation of the mental concept of bodily objects and of bodily objects of various kinds. And we note here, as far as we are aware, the physicist highlights quite possibly the least commented upon problem of the last 130 years plus and beyond, which, as it appears, directly affects our ideas of reality. This problem is our narrow understanding of world formation, which forms the foundation of our address in this series on our imagination. In part 4, we'll explore the 7th view on the imagination. The immense imagination of nature. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support. We appreciate that. Until next time.